I want you to imagine that you're the lead guitarist of a rock band. And you love this band, it's your passion, this is all you care about is this rock band, okay? But you're in need of a new keyboard player. So what do? You look for a keyboard player. You have a lot of applications, and how do you choose the right one for your band? Do you just look at how good they are at keyboards? How many certificates they had? I don't think so, right? You also want to know what kind of music they like, if they fit your band, if the bass player plays a riff, do they catch up on that? Can you guys hang out together afterwards? So you're going to look for what we call fit, right? It's not just going to be they're very proficient, of course that's very important, but you also want to know that they're going to fit into your band. And now on the other side, let's say that your band is disbanded, and you have to look for a new band. So what's going to be the things that you look at? Are you just going to look at how high they are on the Billboard charts, or how much money they offer? Sure, that's important, right? But probably there are many bands who offer around the same amount of money. You also want to know, is the music that they're playing the kind of music that I can get into? Do I feel comfortable with this band? Again, it's this concept of fit, right? So strangely enough, that's related to the US and how they approach education and how they approach what students universities accept, and also from the part of the students, what universities they choose to go to. The concept of fit is central to this, and this is a very different philosophy than most people are used to. And so today I'm going to talk about the US university system and how it might be different in many ways from what you might think it is. I'm going to talk about three aspects. First of all, the education itself and the approach to education and the philosophy behind it. Second of all, the process of applying and getting into the school that you want to get into. And third of all, the value, the concept of the value of the education there. So to start with the philosophy itself, thinking about, for instance, the British system. You choose the course ahead of time. You study for 3 years. And you usually just want to get into the best school that there is for that particular course. It's fairly simple, and it's very effective. And of course, this school is named after Cambridge, one of the best universities in the world. In the US, the philosophy is a little bit different. At the center of the US education system is something that they call liberal arts. So you might have heard of this, or maybe you're thinking, what's liberal arts? Is that, am I going to be painting at the school or something? That's not the case. Liberal arts is an idea that you're not just going to study one subject, you're going to take many different subjects. You do have one major, but you only typically choose that major in your second or third year of college. And you're also taking a lot of courses outside of your major. If you're studying economics, you're going to be also studying history and some physics maybe. If you're doing engineering even, you have to do some writing courses. So it's a much more broad-minded approach to education. And if you look at a school like Harvard, for instance, they don't even have an undergraduate business program because they believe so much that they don't want you to just approach education as something that is a certificate to get into a job, but as something that's going to enrich you in many different ways. So that's the central difference between the US education system, which has this broad approach, this holistic approach, and many educational systems around the world that tend to just focus on one course, and that's what you do. And also, when you're actually at the school, the environment is very different. You're usually part of a campus, right? So you're part of this village where every college student is there, 10,000, 20,000 people on this little island of academia, right? In the rest of the world, it's not usually the case either. You might live with your parents, you might live in an apartment, and then you go to the university and you consume education there, but you're not part of this very immersive kind of village. So that's also very different. And it's really, for 4 years, you become part of this community in a way that you wouldn't elsewhere. So that's something that is very different, I think, from other parts of the world. The second aspect I want to talk about is the application process itself. This is also very different. Let's go to the UK again as an example. You write a fairly straightforward personal statement, again, just about your course that you want to study. You send in your grades. That's about it, right? Maybe a letter of recommendation also. And for Oxford and Cambridge, an interview, medicine has a different process, but essentially it's quite straightforward. And again, it's the higher you score, the better your chances. And that's about the only parameter. In the US, again, this concept of fit becomes really important, and so they look at a lot more aspects of who you are, not just as somebody who wants to study X, Y, or Z, but somebody who has a broad range of interests, who has a broad range of passions, and somebody who can fit into the school to which they are applying. So what are the different aspects of getting in that they will look at? I like to call this GATE, G-A-T-E. Those are the main aspects that will be important. That stands for grades, activities, tests, and essays. So grades, of course, is fundamental to any higher education institution. You have to show that you can actually take on the academic work. So that's one of the first things that the admissions officer in the US will look at. The second thing is activities, and this is where it starts to become a little bit different. In the UK, for instance, for your personal statement, you also have to talk about your activities, but it's usually related to the major. So you might have done an internship that's related to the engineering major that you want to pursue, and you'll talk about that. But if you were into, let's say, ballet, and you want to do economics, it might be hard to talk about that. In the US, that's precisely what you should be talking about. It's not just about you have done things that are related to the major or the course that you want to do. You want to show that you have passions that aren't necessarily academic in nature, but that show that you're more than just your grades, that show that you are a complete person. Again, this holistic approach to education. The third aspect is test scores. Aside from medicine in the UK and some other parts of the world, usually grades will be the main factor in accepting students. In the US, you have to take some more tests. You have to take either the ACT or the SAT. That's the main test. And then you also will have to do things called subject tests for some of the more top schools. The ACT or SAT is originally supposed to be an intelligence test. It's not really. You can study for it, but it covers mathematics and English broadly. And so you have to show that you are at a high level in that. The subject tests are tests that cover specific subjects. So that's the third thing that these schools will look at. And then the last thing, that's where they really get to know you as a person, where this concept of fit becomes the most important, the most appropriate. These are the essays. You won't just have to write one personal statement. You'll have to write a lot of essays, usually around 3 for each school to which you apply. And there's no limit on application, so if you apply to 10, 12 schools, you might have to write 30 essays. It's a lot of writing, but this is what admissions officers in the US spend 3/4 of the time that they're evaluating you. They spend it on these essays. This is where they get to know you as a person and whether they think that you fit into this school. So they know your test scores, they know your grades, they know how good you are academically, but there's 10, 20 other people for that same spot who also have these qualifications. That's why they look at these essays. And they're also quite different from anything you might have had to write before. You have to write personal essays about your experiences, about things that have been important to you throughout your life, something that's been difficult for you, from which you have grown. For instance, maybe you were a superstar in football, and then you broke your legs and you had to really reevaluate who you were, and then you became really involved in music or something like that. It can also be something a lot more personal. For instance, maybe you had a friend who had an eating disorder. That's a very delicate subject, right? If you handle that well. It can also show maturity. It can show growth. These are things that you could never dream of having to address in most university applications, right? You will also have to write essays for each school individually. So this one essay that I was just describing is the main, what's called the personal statement that you send to every single school, mostly in the US. You also have to write individual essays for each school. And there, you have to address this concept of fit even more minutely. So you have to maybe talk about, why do I want to go to this particular school? And it's not enough to say they're ranked high, they're very good at computer science. You have to say they have a basketball team which has the spirit which I really love, and I love basketball. You have to say they have a curriculum that's very unique, where you get to choose every course that you want to do is open for you to choose. And there's no restrictions, and that's what I like, because that's the philosophy that I believe in. So you have to really explain to them that you understand what the university stands for, and that you can connect with that, and that you can contribute to that. And that's why these essays are so vital, and you have to approach them very seriously. The third thing I want to talk about is the value of the US education system, which is very, again, slightly different from other systems around the world. As you might know, it's extremely expensive. Sometimes you have to spend $70,000 per year, US dollars, on everything included. So the tuition, housing, etc. So that's 250,000 dirhams. So you might think that's insane. Why would I ever want to do that? But again, you tend to get a lot more back for that. Again, first of all, there's this entire academic village concept. So you don't just have the classes, but you have this entire campus full of opportunities and activities that you can engage in. But there's also a lot more funds available for other things. The total pile of money that a university has is called an endowment. And in the UK, there's only 2 schools that have an endowment of over $1 billion, Oxford and Cambridge. In Canada, there's 1, Toronto. In the US, there's over 70. So there's a lot more schools that have a lot of money to provide you with research opportunities, to offer counseling services, to help you in many different ways. Harvard, for instance, has over $30 billion. This money will also be used for scholarships. So even if you think that maybe it's totally out of my reach, if you target the universities correctly, you can actually find some that will give you merit-based scholarships, so that you can still go there for a reasonable sum of money. And again, make use of that very different, very unique educational system. So those are the 3 aspects I wanted to talk about. I hope you learned a little bit. And I just wanted to also open this up to questions. Does anybody have any questions about this entire field of US education? Yes? Very good question. No, they do. So that's exactly what they would be looking at. So you have, again, the first thing is your grades and your test scores, and that is important. But if you have made your own machine, then that's something that's really impressive, right? And that wouldn't show up in your physics grade. And that's precisely what, first of all, there's a list of activities that you can write about in the application, where that can be your #1 activity. And then the admissions officer will know straight away that this is amazing, this person has created their own machine at age 17, 18, And second of all, if it's relevant to an essay, then you can also put it in there if it's very important to you, and it fits in, of course. So again, the idea is to have an impression of the student, not just as a list of numbers, but as something much fuller, and something that the thing that you just described is precisely what they would be interested in. All right, very good question. Yeah, what do you do to make your application stand out? Many people think that you have to be well-rounded. So you have to do, like I have students coming to me and they say, well, I've never done I don't do a sport. So what do I do? Do I pick up table tennis or something? That's not the case. You have to choose things about which you're passionate, and it's much better to have 2-3 things that really stand out that you've been committed to for a long time than to have 20 things that you're very peripherally involved in. There's two main things that are important in activity, and one is achievement and the other is commitment. So if you've done something for many years and you've really grown in that activity, then that makes it a really, really impressive activity. You just mentioned internships. I'd be really careful with those, because if you do like 1-2 week internship, even if it's related to the major that you want to do, it often comes across as perhaps your parents arranged that for you or something, or you got it through connections, and then maybe you were getting coffee for 2 weeks or something. If you spend a whole summer volunteering in, let's say, India or something, you teach young children who don't have as good access to education as you've had in the past. And that's much more impactful, and that shows more passion, and it's much more valuable than doing like a 2-week internship or something like that. But the main thing is that you choose a few activities that you can really excel in and about which you're passionate, and they don't have to be related to the major you want to do or anything, as long as they have those two qualities. Yeah. That's also a very good question. There's many things that you can do to still get accepted to very good universities, or to the university that you want to get into. The first thing is that for these standardized tests, if you have a condition that you can prove, then you actually will be given more time to do that test. So there's a few ways that you can get around that, and then the testing will take account of that. Secondly, there's a section in the applications called additional information, which is designed specifically for these kinds of things. Most people will leave that blank, or maybe have mention a few things they haven't been able to mention in their applications. But yeah, if you are struggling with autism, for instance, then that's a hugely important factor in your life. And if that hasn't been able to make it into your applications, then you put that in, or even if it has, you should put it into the additional information section, and the admissions officer will take account of that. And if you're still, so they'll again look at you as a complete person, and if they're convinced that you can still excel at this school in a way that's taking account of your condition, then you will still be accepted. And even if when you get to the school, there are many resources for special needs students. So for instance, when I was studying, I used to take notes on a carbon paper for people who couldn't take notes themselves, and so it would be scanned in, and then they would be able to also be able to enjoy the class effectively. Anyone else?
So when applying to a university, the university probably gets hundreds of applications that are just unique in their own way, have their own spin on them. So would you say that luck is an important factor in the decision?
It really is, actually. Luck is a factor for sure. The analogy that I like to use is, there was a study done in Israel where they had people in jail who were up for parole, meaning that, and that happens every 5 years. And when you are granted parole, then you're free to go, essentially. You're monitored, restricted, but you are no longer in prison. That's a hugely important thing in your life, probably more important than your university application process, right? They did this study, and they looked at the judge who decides on the parole, and what factors affected his or her decision. And what they found was that in the morning, when the judge just started out, the percentage of people being granted parole was high. I think it was above 50% or something. And as the day wore on, right before lunch, it dropped and dropped and dropped until I think it was below 20, right before lunch. Then the judge would have lunch. Afterwards, very high again, and towards the end of the day, again it was very low. So there you can see that this is a hugely important decision in somebody's life, and it's essentially being made with a huge factor of randomness, a huge factor of luck. And that's one of the things that you can think, if an admissions officer is reading your application, how many different things can impact that? Maybe they've been up all night reading different applications, maybe they're very well rested and they feel great, maybe they just, somebody just, like their fiance just proposed to them, who knows, There's definitely luck involved, and that's why you have to broaden your options, and you have to, there's just the thing you have to deal with, and you have to accept that and just try to make the application as strong as you possibly can. And that's also, if you don't get into the school that you really want to get into, then take heart in the fact that it's so competitive. Some of these schools have 5% acceptance rates, and you did your best, and there is luck involved, and that might just be the key as to why you didn't get it.
I've read a few articles that state that some American universities, they accept students just based on their diverse backgrounds, or just to increase the student population of different areas, to increase diversity, instead of based on their qualifications and their merits. So is that something that's more important? Do you think it is something that's more important to admissions counselors, or do you think that they look at someone's application, do they value diversity more than other factors?
Yeah. Do they value diversity? That's another good question. They definitely do. It's one of the kind of unspoken secrets. In the UK, they read your application anonymously. In the US, they don't, and that is something that they look at. It's one factor. It's not decisive. I mean, it's not the only factor they look at. If you are from a minority that they would like to have, you still have to get the grades that they would expect, etc. But if you're an applicant from Togo or something, not a very big country in Africa, probably there's a high chance that a school would never have had somebody from Togo at their school. If you're a good candidate, you're quite likely to get into that school just for that very reason. Then they can say we've had somebody from Togo here. Now we represent, let's say, 115 countries. So that is a factor. And then if you're from a country that has a lot of applicants, let's say from China or from India, you are actually at a bit of a disadvantage because of that, because they have so many people from that region, from those countries applying, that they will not accept as many. And even for most international students, it's slightly harder to get in because they don't have as many spots for them. There's a few different factors that are like that. For instance, if you're a student athlete, you might get into a school that you otherwise wouldn't get into, just because the coach wants you to get into the team. Or if you're what's called a legacy, so maybe your parents went to the school, then you also have a higher chance. But the diversity factor is part of that, yes.
Can you tell us more about how financial aid works?
Sure. So there's two types of financial aid. The first one is need-based aid, and the second one is merit-based aid. So let me just go into those very briefly. Need-based aid is based on, as the term suggests, how much you need the aid. So the issue with that aid, though, is that it's mostly available for American students. So if you have an American passport, you can apply to that. If you don't, then it becomes much more difficult. This is also where how wealthy the schools comes into play. If you're a very, very strong student and you're applying to, let's say, the Ivies and stuff, which are extremely difficult programs to get into, they have a lot more funds available for students who need it. So, for instance, Harvard, they'll meet all the demonstrated need of the students who are applying. So if you're in that position, even if you're an international student, then you will get the aid. However, for most schools, and especially for state schools, University of California comes to mind, or the University of Texas, then that aid is really only available for American students. And so that's a bit difficult to get. Merit-based aid is not based on need, but on how much you deserve to get the aid. So, well, let me explain that a little more clearly. If the school really wants you to come to their school, and they know that you probably have other offers from maybe higher-ranked schools, then they'll say, okay, we're going to cut, let's say, $30,000 per year off of your tuition price. And so that's, again, certain schools will do that more often than others. State schools, again, don't do that because they have fewer funds available, and they're mostly available for the state students. But if you know where to look,